Hi, welcome everybody to the first 2024 Neurocritical Care Society Perspectives podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Nick Morris from the University of Maryland. And with me today, I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Nerissa Ko. Dr. Ko, for those who don't know, which I think are very few, is Professor of Neurology, as well as Vice Chair for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in the Department of Neurology, and the William K. Bowes Jr. Foundation Endowed Professor of Neurocritical Care at the University of California, San Francisco, where she also did her training. She currently serves as the Associate Director of the UCSF Neurovascular Service, the Medical Director of the Adult Neurointensive Care Units, and the Director of the Neurocritical Care Fellowship. And as we'll discuss later, those are just a few of her many, many titles. Dr. Ko has had a successful clinical research program in subarachnoid hemorrhage and brain aneurysms, and her health interests include health equity and research in disparities in stroke and hemorrhagic stroke in particular. A couple of years ago, she gave the NCS keynote address entitled NCS Journey from Wink to Ink, Revisiting the Role of Professional Medical Societies in Healthcare and Diversity. And we were lucky enough to have her on the podcast, but it was only for 3 minutes, and that wasn't nearly enough. So welcome, Dr. Ko. I'd love to speak to you for the next 30 or 40 minutes so we can hear more about all of your fantastic work, particularly in the areas of diversity, equity, inclusion.
Thank you, Nick, for having me, and welcome everyone. I'm really honored to be a guest on the podcast.
Great. Well, let's just jump right into this. When did you get started on this career path of making DEI really core to your career?
I don't actually even think about sort of when it started, because it's always been a fabric of my being from, I guess, just my whole training career. It only really became formalized in more recent years. But I think, a lot of it comes from just your own personal background. I'm the daughter of Filipino immigrants that was really just privileged to take advantage of higher education here in the United States. I actually, really didn't know I wanted to be a doctor. I didn't really have a lot of role models or other people to look up to, and really actually went to Cal as a business major and realized I'm really no good at money and business things to this day, and really met some amazing instructors and teachers that were quite inspirational to me as a young college student, and then really found my way to finding some wonderful mentors throughout my medical school training. And I think that's part of it, is just the sense of service and giving back has always been part of my upbringing and who I am, and never really called it DEI work, honestly. It was just really, the reason I went into medicine is to serve others. And so it was just sort of part of the fabric of my being. When I was in academic medicine, I think became pretty clear there were a lot of inequities, especially towards women, and gender inequities that thankfully I didn't have too many sort of serious repercussions from, but I certainly became part of an advocacy group of women trying to move forward in academia. And that sort of maybe was my formal sort of step into the space. And then the Neurocritical Care Society was just this incredible place for women in this career. And it was really just such a wonderful home. And I really felt like I found colleagues who were having shared experiences and really wanted to make things better for those trainees and other more junior people coming below us and entering into the field.
Got it. Well, we have so many strong women leaders in neurocritical care right now, and in the society in particular. But can you kind of take me back? You mentioned the importance of some of those early mentors you had in medical school and beyond. How important is it that those mentors represent both in sort of culture and even in looks the people that they are mentoring, their mentees?
Right. And, I think in early on in my career, there weren't exactly a lot of people who looked like me. So I was lucky to have mentors who just believed in me and could see that I could do that. And to this day, Wade Smith is someone I have the privilege of working with day to day. But really, when I was a medical student, must have seen something in me that he thought was promising, and really encouraged me to go into neurology at UCSF, and really wanted to basically grow up and be like him. So I don't think your mentors have to necessarily always look like you. but they also have to support you for who you are and not try to turn you into something that you're not. And so it's not so much, especially when there aren't always mentors who look exactly like you. It's actually someone who can see who for who you are and really support your values and interests moving forward. Thankfully, there's actually many more mentors that look like our patients, that look like us, and that certainly helps a lot in terms of understanding that shared experience a little bit better, and that's also helped to find more connections, because it's not always. I think I was very privileged and lucky to find good people along the way, even though they weren't necessarily, aligned with who my identity was. But I think at the same time, it's really important to, I didn't know what I was missing, honestly. And I think now that I see so many more richness of our faculty and trainees and all the different kind of providers in our neurocritical care space, diversity is defined pretty broadly. You may find actually a mixture of people who really meet all of your individual needs. And I think that's probably the best advice from my experiences. It's probably not fair to have one mentor fit all of that. And you kind of have to find different people who might be able to supplement areas of your career and professional and personal life that really allow you to kind of be, your best self.
And what role has the society had in helping connect some of these people that you were talking about?
Yeah, and so when the society first started, I think way back, it was pretty small. We fit in one ballroom, the entire meeting, in one single hotel ballroom, and I think it was somewhere in Arizona, probably Scottsdale. I think is there for the first official meeting. And I remember then there were some obviously incredible leaders in the field already that I admired and idolize even to this day. But there were a lot of other people who were just excited about this new emerging field. There were actually quite a lot of women leaders, like you said. I think the Cheryl Lee Changs of the world, I think, inspired many of us who were just starting our career to see someone who was actually an officer and eventually the president of the society very early on. And I think those kinds of people that I didn't know very well back then, but have learned to get to know and have the privilege of really calling a colleague and a friend has been really inspiring and inspirational to a lot of generations of people coming. Obviously, there were a lot of things that we needed to do, a lot of work to be done to create a new society, but there were actually a lot of roles for people to take back then. And I definitely am not the first to jump into things, and I tend to sort of lead from behind, and that's fine. I think there were a lot of people who embraced all of us new people coming in, and also tried to find ways we could contribute to the society and things of that nature. But there were some really early kind of leaders that I think were so welcoming and really visionary in starting our society.
And when I think about your keynote and this transition from Wink to Ink, maybe we can start with Wink. And so, why did Wink start? Why was it necessary? And what importance did it have to you?
Yeah, and like I said, the medical education and academic medicine in particular has always had its challenges and issues. There's a lot of structural biases in just the way those institutions have come up. And I think, there were a lot of really amazing women early on who started to look at some hard data around salary inequity. We are an emerging field, and obviously both men and women entering into this space, and yet we're finding that women were getting paid, significantly less than their male counterparts. And so I think there was sort of a need to really be a strong advocate and use the society's platform as a way to sort of, bring these issues forward. At the time, a lot of folks were still trying to figure out how to balance an ICU career with starting family and childcare and things like that. And so these were always top of mind issues for many of the women in the society. And it was incredible to sort of have a handful of brave women just sort of begin to look at within the society data. And since then, there have been numerous publications by the society Wink group around, are we actually not offering the same opportunities for women in terms of speaking at meetings, opportunities to participate in leadership roles, opportunities for grant funding? And so when looking at the landscape of data, and also including our non-MD colleagues as well, I think that was something very early on in the society, to be inclusive of multiple disciplines within the society. And so that was some of the early work of Wink. And as the cadre of women grew and grew and grew, you could see that climate survey change over time, where there were many more women in leadership roles, much more balanced, hopefully more obvious to attendees, that there were actually a great balance of women speakers and panelists, moderators. And I think that did not come without intention. That came from a lot of advocacy and work by Wink. And I think the basic principles of just equal opportunity for every member of the society to be able to participate and contribute.
Can you talk a little bit more about how you and other members of Wink, or perhaps you in your work at UCSF, have convinced leadership to really buy into these concepts and push them forward into something that's taken seriously, where someone can be at the level of vice chair of diversity, equity, inclusion, instead of sort of just some type of side project that doesn't really get any backing?
Right. And, it is a lot of timing and the climate and when it was right to kind of do that. I think the need for this has always been there. And there were many of our predecessors who had to sort of be the pioneers in pushing the envelope and really being brave enough, often to personal risk and cost, to sort of say and call out inequities when they exist. I think our newer generations are growing up in a different time and climate where it's an expectation. And I think we have to not forget the past struggles, and to remember that it took a lot of work and sacrifice to convince hearts and minds that it's not a threat to have different opinions and people in different leadership roles, that in fact, and this is very much backed by data, sometimes the data had to catch up to the culture change, that having more voices and a unique set of voices actually is more innovative. It makes organizations more nimble and facile, and allows growth, and really it's actually good for organizations in all sectors, not just in medicine. I think in medicine, I feel like we're a little bit behind some of our colleagues in other sectors. But I do think that there's very little data now that would dispute the benefit of diversity. But I think that, change is hard for a lot of things. And even for those who feel strongly about this, you can make changes, but if it becomes a hostile environment and not a productive one, then you're actually more productive when it wasn't sort of so overt at times. I probably have to push out of my comfort zone a lot in terms of, taking on more leadership roles, because I was happily doing much of this work in the background and continuing to do what I could as an individual, or partnering with good people that I knew were fighting the good fight. And it was very personally satisfying, and not a lot of personal risk. I think those are sort of the things that are our comfort zones. But I think as you take on a leadership role, first of all, it's a privilege to be asked to do something on behalf of others. But I think that was the reason I said yes, that, the amount of influence and power I could have at a different level would really, amplify the work that I was already doing on the ground level, and allow me to help more people in a more meaningful way. And so despite my discomfort with these kinds of positions, I found that, as long as I could stay true to my own leadership style and the way I like to work, then I would be able to sort of find my own way to be effective in this space. And I'm not somebody who is necessarily like first in line to sort of rally the folks. I tend to lead standing shoulder to shoulder with folks, and often behind them, pushing people forward, because I don't need the credit for anything. To me, the product and the outcome is more important, speaks for itself.
Yeah. If you're comfortable sharing, would you mind maybe telling a specific story about perhaps a momentous breakthrough that you had in this work, or something that you felt really put yourself at risk, but ended up being a win for not just yourself, but for this movement?
Yeah, and like I said, I have been very lucky to be surrounded by such supportive people who really believe in me. And, from my department chair to, my division chief Wade and folks like Claude, I think that I've always had tremendous allyship in this work. So I don't think I've ever felt particularly vulnerable. I think it's a little bit of my approach. I tend to try to meet people where they are and try to bring data when it exists, because I think that's somewhat neutral and less sort of emotional that's there. But I think the times have really pushed us to also, myself included, to come out of my comfort zone a little bit more and to call out things that I see in real time. I think in the past, we often are frozen in the moment when something terrible happens in front of you. And for those who've had terrible things happen directly to them, you kind of learn to use humor to kind of deal with it in the moment and diffuse the situation, but then process it in your own private space with maybe a small group of colleagues afterwards, because it is quite painful in the moment.
Mm-hmm.
But I think as my own personal evolution, I've definitely increased my ability to be an ally and more vocal to call out inequity when I see it, to actually put a stop to it in the moment, because it's not about me. It's about that person there that I need to make sure that they are heard and seen. And it's been a shift. I think to me, that's not putting me in a vulnerable place. That's protecting someone who's in a vulnerable spot and needs someone to be a physical barrier, if not an emotional kind of mirror or barrier to what they're experiencing at the time. And so that's actually been a more journey as I've gotten older in the space, to actually take more risks. And yeah, sometimes it's in a patient care setting where patients are going to yell at me and tell me to get out of the room. But it's not really, it's not really this type of space where, we can allow patients a certain amount of leeway because they're patients, but not to cross certain lines of professionalism, even in a hospitalized setting when their patients have illness and things like that. And so I think there have been, unfortunately, many moments where I've had to protect a trainee or to basically tell a patient to stop, or else they can no longer get care here. And I think those are things I probably wouldn't have done 10 years ago. But I certainly feel more empowered to do so now. And I think our trainees and students often expect that of us. And many, amazingly, are strong enough human beings and more advanced human beings to actually advocate for themselves in that moment, which is a beautiful thing to see.
Yeah, yeah. I was talking to one of my colleagues recently about how I think there's been, and rightfully so, a real focus on what we've termed microaggressions, but macroaggressions are happening all around us sometimes.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
sometimes we forget to actually how important it is to speak in the moment about macroaggressions, and not just looking out for these more subtle slights. So that really speaks to me. Now, as Wink sort of transitioned to Ink, can you describe a little bit about why that happened and what the goal is?
I think this was a maturation of the society. The principles that really, a lot of the early work that Wink did was around equity and inclusion. And that applies obviously to the gender lens that we were using at the time. But, honestly, it applied to many more people. And those who were not identified as women were facing similar struggles, and yet there was no place for them. And as the society was growing, becoming more diverse, really trying to meet the needs of modern neurointensivists, it was really part of that maturation process, and really grew organically under kind of the leadership of Diana Chandos Green, who's quite visionary in this area. I think she could see that, not that we were not going to continue work in the gender space, but to really now embrace others who really didn't have a home in the society. there really wasn't a place for sexual gender minorities, for UIM. There really wasn't anywhere in the society that could really address those issues and bring those forward, both in the science, in the meeting content, in the leadership roles. And so it was a natural kind of progression that came. And it took a couple of years to sort of figure out what this would look like. But the board of directors and the officers at the time were really embracing that. We really that's when the diversity statement came out for the society. I think that was sort of part of the transition process to really outwardly kind of have a diversity statement. And this was kind of a sign of the times. Many other national institutions and societies were doing the same. And so we definitely wanted to make sure that we were not the last ones to sort of do this as well. And I think the way we've done it at NCS is unique, because it really does have this formal committee now that has multiple arms and really does have a lot of influence in all of these sort of sectors of our society. And it's amazing how much it's grown in just a few short years. And I know you're part of that early experience yourself.
It is. I noticed in doing some reading, you're doing some anti-racism work at UCSF, and I wonder, for the listeners who aren't familiar with the term anti-racism, if you could describe a little bit what that's about and what you're doing in your department.
Yeah, it's so funny. I forget I'm a little bit in my California UCSF bubble. It's part of the vocabulary around here. I would say that maybe the best learning I've done around this was around one of the national experts, Kamara Jones. She came to be a presidential scholar at the university for the couple of years ago, and spent a year with us, kind of talking to all the diversity officers. And I think inherently we know that racism exists in our culture, in our world, and it's pervasive in many areas, whether it's overt, like in macroaggression ways, or more subtle in microaggression ways, or more challenging in a structural way, because that's the way systems were set up. But she really sort of made me think about things a little differently and say, if you don't call it out, then it actually is hard to sort of, it is so sort of amorphous sometimes, the concept, that if you don't actually name it and call it out, and how is it impacting people in your whatever environment you're in. It can be on a very small level in your unit. It can be in a larger level like your department. It could be at an even larger level at your university. If you don't actually name it and call it out for what it is, then it's hard to actually do anything about it. And so part of the naming of anti-racism is to just sort of put some terminology around what actually we all know to exist. Whether we try to pretend it doesn't affect us, I think that's part of the calling it out a little bit, is having a uncomfortable, difficult conversation around it. I think that's the first step, is acknowledging that it does exist and that you actively choose to be anti-racist.
Yeah.
And I think that's really the terminology, is that, we all don't consider ourselves labeled one way or the other. But I think when you actually intentionally try to do things that is counter to racism, then you do anti-racism work. And I think I've never thought of it that way, honestly. And it's certainly not a terminology I've coined. And it's certainly something it's taken me a while to get comfortable with it. To be honest, this is not something that flows off the tongue easily. And I still, in certain environments, have to be a little bit mindful of that. Because it is a pretty charged term, and it also makes people feel a little bit defensive. And that's never been my approach, is to approach people from a defensive stance. It's really to make sure that it's collaborative. But there is something to calling it out when you see it, and naming it and saying, okay, now what are we going to do to counter that? And so this is where initiatives that are intended to counter existing systems that are biased are really helpful. And in small ways, it just means transparency. It means having processes where none existed. And even at NCS, we actually started putting more actual bylaws into how people get leadership roles, and term limits, and to actually like nomination processes, because in the past, people would just sort of tap a friend on the shoulder and be like, hey, do you want to lead this committee next year? And that's all good, but I think that it isn't necessarily giving opportunity for those who are not in the know, or maybe don't have the same privilege or connections. And so some of it is just as simple as that, when we sort of intentionally reassess what we do and make sure that it is in the framework of being more inclusive and equitable, then, whatever you call it, that's really what we're talking about. But I think, this idea of naming something really makes people actually pay attention to you, if for good or for bad. Sometimes it's because they feel threatened by, what are you doing? Are you kind of trying to come into my space and do something? And nationally, there's a real fear of that. And unfortunately, there's some repercussions of that. And we're seeing that narrative in our country right now. So it's not necessarily a safe term either.
No.
But I think it's not meant to be harmful to people. I think it's really trying to think of it as a counter narrative to sort of create things that are intentionally more inclusive for people.
I love that. And thank you for that really nice description. I think key to the concept, as I understand, is that it's the racism that we're talking about is mostly the racism that's been baked into systems and structures by people, but it's not about people in particular. It's about the structures and systems they've created that perpetuate these things. And so we have to be, as you said, mindful to address them. And as you mentioned with I think, recent events at some of our other major academic institutions in the country, there's been new spotlight shined again on a lot of this, and a lot of it I think is again at risk. So it points out the importance of places like Inc. and points out the importance of the work that you're doing to be strongholds where people can, I think, feel open in discussing these terms that are charged and feel safe in doing so. So I really thank you for helping us establish those.
It's not an easy area, and certainly I am no expert. And I think one of the best things that I've learned is to be a good listener and to listen with an open mind and an open heart, because I'm learning too about this area. I don't have any solutions or answers to things that have been baked into my upbringing. Like, this is part of who I am too. I don't even know it, that I've been a participant in some of these sort of structures that have privileged others and disadvantaged others. And I don't consider myself doing that on purpose, but it was sort of the only way I knew how to do things. And so I think being able to listen to people and to understand their lived experience, maybe I can't relate, or I may not even be able to empathize, but to be able to hear and understand why things happen to them because of who they are. And if there's anything we can do to change that narrative, maybe for them in the moment, but maybe for future generations, so they don't have to kind of go through the same thing again. I think that's where it comes down to me, is really thinking about it that way. And that makes it easier for me to sort of feel less helpless at times of trying to move, mountains that don't want to be moved.
Right. Now, I'm going to ask you to wear your fellowship director hat for a second and tell me, how much of this should we be explicitly educating our trainees in? Is this part of neurology residency or neurocritical care fellowship in a way where we should dedicate explicit teaching time, didactics, et cetera? Or is it more of this sort of implicit learning on rounds? Where do you fall on that?
Yeah, it's also been a progressive journey as well. I think, as typical, our medical schools are leading the charge here. The students demand it. They actually do not accept the curriculum as it existed. And at least for us at UCSF, wanted it changed. Like, this is not the way you should teach medicine. It should be more culturally sensitive. It should include some of the history of things we should be accountable for. There are a lot of terrible things we did in medicine, and we own that history, and that should be part of the teaching as well. And so that's sort of the area in the students that are coming through. Our residency program is incredibly diverse. And so you can't sort of teach residents now without accepting that they come from so many different backgrounds, whether it's their own personal identity backgrounds, but also their background. They're coming from public health sides. They're coming from, all kinds of scientists, research backgrounds, and so how do we sort of design teaching neurology to that? And the patients are ever more diverse, and so we also have to be prepared to take care of them. And part of that is if we don't equip our trainees to have the tools to take care of an ever diverse patient population, then we kind of fail in the mission too. And so I do think the kind of super specialty chain, which where I put neurocritical care, it's kind of trickling up, but that's kind of too slow for me.
Yeah.
So I do think that the modern day kind of education needs to, at some level, be inclusive of that. There's sort of the forced training of like spoon-fed DEI things, and I think as most institutions do some required training and all of that. So we do that too. But that doesn't always stick with people. And then there's sort of the, people who want to be educators. So we have an educator track. And then those kinds of people who are really wanting to teach for the future, this is a skill set that is needed. You can't be an educator in the modern kind of medical era without teaching DEI concepts, or at least have an understanding of social determinants of health and kind of the broader sort of holistic view of patients. So I think that part is definitely part of sort of the way we take care of patients. And it is, somewhat borrowed from our medical school and residency training where, we actually talk about those things on rounds. It's actually part of the whatever formula you use for ICU rounds. After you talk about lines and drains and DVT prophylaxis, you actually talk about, what any special needs for this patient and this family. And I think naturally intensivists already do that. We're so patient-centric. We're always thinking about sort of palliative care issues or end-of-life issues, or I think we're actually better at this than most people in medicine, sort of taking a holistic view of our patients and really being in the moment, because we are privileged in our role to be the intimate kind of contacts during times of distress. There's like a innate trust hopefully between patients and their intensivists during times of near-death experiences that automatically puts you in that space. But there are times where that trust needs to be earned a little bit, and that's where some of these skills come in, of sort of thinking about, what is going on here that's sort of making this interaction a little bit more challenging than others I've had, and I think that's where we are sort of constantly evolving in this space, and I think it comes out a lot in palliative care discussions and brain death discussions. I think we are very well versed in these ways, but we can always learn to be more informed and better at it. And I think this is also a subject of many of our neurocritical care researchers, that are starting to look at sort of how we message and do these things. And so I'm happy to see that, coming into our science, and we're going to hopefully lead a little bit in this area. And I think that's the kind of stuff that is not part of a formal curriculum, but we should, I teach my fellows like apprentices. For us, it's an apprenticeship. That's the kind of stuff where we debrief about difficult conversations and, where do you think that could have been better? And that's sort of the way that I teach fellows to kind of do some of this work, because it is so inherent to our job. So I do think we are really poised to lead in this area, but there's probably needs to be more formality to it. And that's actually my hope for sort of the future in this space, is that neurocritical care educators and fellowship directors are really going to start to sort of think about this more intentionally, because I do think we're really skilled at it. It's actually something we probably all do well, and better than many of our colleagues, actually.
Yeah, well, in any case, I think that the transition to being an ACGMEA fellowship has forced some of us who haven't thought about these topics as often to actually reckon with them, and perhaps add some of this content to our curriculum for fellows. So I think that's been actually a positive byproduct that I didn't really see coming when I thought about this transition.
Yeah.
Yeah. You mentioned some of the work in palliative care and shared decision making and the way that our communication with families has changed. What other areas as a fellowship director have you seen kind of develop over your career, and what changes do you see in the future for the way that we train our fellows?
I think that the way I'm old already, so I think the way I was trained to be an intensivist was really like, you're all in, fully sacrifice yourself and everything for like whatever your shift is. It is still a shift, so that makes it sort of manageable for that short term. But I do think that if anything, post-pandemic, people are really rethinking work. The pandemic really took a toll on many intensivists. I think we were the ones that had to bear the brunt of the sickest of the sick, all hands on deck, whether you're a neurointensivist or not. You really had to deal with probably the scale of illness that hit most of our medical centers that was beyond our expectation. And the aftermath of that is real. I do think that a lot of intensivists suffered a lot of things mentally. It physically took a toll on people, and I think that people are really not willing to do that again. And I think that there are a lot of people, I saw good colleagues of mine who decided not to come back and retire early, and that's a shame. But I think that our newest generation of people are really thinking of work a different way. They've grown up in a culture of work hours
Mhm.
and different kinds of parameters. And I think that expectation for them to, you know, sacrifice everything for the job is not really the same. And I'm not sure that's all bad. I think we really think about more balance and sustainability. We've always been understaffed in ICUs. I mean, who thought it was ever right that 16 bed units should be managed by one attending? Like, that doesn't make any sense.
Mm.
And so I think that we probably need to think about ways that we should reorganize ICU care so that patients get the best of us and not sort of the like, trying to hold it together for the next few hours till the help is on the way kind of feeling. And that'll happen, at moments, but it shouldn't be on the daily.
Yeah.
And I do think that burnout and wellness is sort of the new language of GME and non-ACGME training programs. But it's also, it's usually the same thing, for intensivists who are practicing. It's hard to teach that and model that if you're not doing that for yourself. And so I do think we're in a new era of how to protect ourselves for the long haul and for the longevity of things. Reprioritizing kind of how we work is really important. And I think as a society, thinking about ways we can advocate for proper staffing ratios, for really paying to have teams of people that are, maybe our shifts are too long, or maybe our staffing ratio models are not correct, and I think these are things that we can do on a more national level than at an individual institutional level. But I think it starts with really prioritizing each other's wellness and well-being, and that way we can do that and model that better for the next generation of trainees. Because like you said, the ACGME is going to force it upon us
Yep.
anyway.
Yep. It's already here.
But it's really hard. There's a cultural shift,
There
right? Like,
is.
I don't even know what that looks like for when in a program when like the ICU is not designed that way.
No.
It's not designed for provider wellness. So I do think that's going to be our biggest challenge in the future, of trying to still, hold to our principles of being good doctors and taking the best care of patients. And how do we sort of balance that with taking care of ourselves as well? And I think there is a way forward. But I don't know what that looks like yet.
Yeah, it's no, I struggle thinking about this all the time. I wonder if in the end it's gonna be a trickle up effect. We're starting to see residencies unionize.
Yeah, yeah.
And that's what nurses in general have done in order to ensure safe ratios. And maybe that's where it's going for attending physicians. I can't imagine. I actually, as a trainee, went through picket lines in order to go be a resident as the nurses stood outside, and that was a really memorable and impactful moment for me. But I never saw physicians do it, and now we're starting to see that in the residencies, and maybe it'll go beyond, because I don't see a way forward given the shortage of physicians to
Yeah.
improve staffing. It's a real tension there. Um,
Right. Right.
yeah, there was this recent paper that came out that maybe you saw in JAM, I think, where they looked at all these different specialties, and they saw the amount of burnout, and I think job satisfaction, or fulfillment, as they said. And both neurology and critical care were pretty high on the burnout scale and pretty low on the self-fulfillment. You've always struck me as someone who's very fulfilled in their job. So what is it that keeps you fulfilled? And maybe what tips do you have for others who are struggling with finding fulfillment in their job? Because in many ways, I think fulfillment is in some ways the antidote for burnout.
Absolutely. I've been lucky that I probably had moments of burnout, but I've never felt so burnt out that I would walk away from this job. You know, I think one thing that I've always had is the humility of the work I do. I'm lucky to do what I do. I have my dream job. I get to go and take care of patients in the place that I find the most comfortable for me in the hospital. I love the ICU and I love taking care of patients, and it's a privilege. And forget that sometimes because you get into the day-to-day grind and the kind of the operational parts of our job. But gosh, we all have it. There's just certain patients that hit you a certain way. There's just certain people that, gosh, you just want to will them to get better. And that, I think, for me, always provides fulfillment. And there are times where I fail in that mission and I lose my patients, but then it switches to like, did I help them transition to passing in the most humane and graceful way possible? And that's fulfillment to me too. So the patient care part's the easiest place to get that fulfillment, honestly. But I also have the privilege of working in an academic medical center. So I don't necessarily have all the burnout issues of those who have to handle this solo. Neurocritical care at its best is a team. And sometimes that team is small. It's just your nurse and you, and that's the best team ever. But we also have all the students and the trainees and the other learners from all the other disciplines that we have to interact with that really make that such a vibrant place. And so to be able to teach and to be able to sort of see that early kind of awe in patients, seeing patients for the first time, like awaken from a coma, or when their status breaks, it's incredible. Like we see that all the time. It's like, whatever, I expected that.
Mm-hmm.
But when like a student or young learner sees that for the first time, it's pretty cool for them. And maybe they're like, oh, maybe I could be a neurologist someday. I think those kinds of moments are also incredibly fulfilling to me too. And so I get a lot of fulfillment from my education and teaching role. And then, my passion projects tend to run a lot in terms of just, some of the DEI work, although sometimes it's hard to see the fruit of your labors in that in real time. But I do think that, I think thinking about our field, just amazing things that are happening. I'm less of a researcher now than I used to be, and that's a shame. I just don't have time anymore to do everything, but I love collaborating with people. And so I still get that sort of innovation and creativeness out of like things that my colleagues are doing that I can participate in still in some way, shape, or form. And so I think for me, and it is a balance of all of those things that allows me to sort of find the fulfillment in these everyday things that we do, and just remind myself, God, I'm so lucky to be here and to have a chance to do the work I do. And that's never lost on me. And so I think that is maybe my best antidote to these things, is just being present and recognizing those moments, because they are fleeting sometimes, because then you got to go off and like code somebody. But it's like, oh, that was really cool. And that was a great thing that we did today. And I always end the day feeling like I did something good, even if it wasn't sort of exactly how I predicted. That's always a good feeling and keeps me coming back for more.
Well, I've certainly found it true in my career that having a diversity of roles is helpful. So if one basket's feeling a little empty, I can kind of fill another, and that helps balance it out. It's a particularly hard clinical day, but I have a really great debriefing with my fellow about that day, then I get something out of that. I said we would hit on this before, and I wanted to know, you have so many roles. You're a fellowship director, you're director of some of the clinical centers there in AVMs and cavernous malformations, you're a vice chair in DEI, you do so much for the society. Where do you find the balance between um, getting fulfillment from all these different places, but not getting so distracted or turned around that you feel like you don't have time for yourself in any way?
Yeah, no, I wouldn't say I'm doing it all well. I think some of these, I call them my passion projects. It's hard to say no to them. And so I found myself sort of saying yes to so many things. And I'm like, oh, great. Now what have I done? But each one of those things, like you said, has fulfillment and value. I stopped doing things that don't have that. That's sort of my criteria for saying yes to things is like, do I actually get something positive and fulfilling out of this? Because if the answer is no, then maybe it's something that's okay to pass on, and someone else who has more passion for it can do it. There are definitely things that I'm stuck with because it's sort of part of the job, and that's okay. But like you said, you balance that out with other things that actually bring you a lot of joy. But there are only so many hours in the day, and so there's definitely times where I have to kind of, reprioritize again, like, well, maybe I shouldn't take on more at this point and do that. And some of it is, like I think for me, taking a back seat to some of the primary research I used to do, I just don't have the time anymore. And that was hard. I'd spent a lot of time dedicated to that. And I used to pride myself on being identifying, as a clinical researcher. I still do, but it's in the lighter form now. I don't do as much grant writing. I don't do as much, paper writing as I used to. And it's also a privilege that I don't have to. I do it because I want to.
Mhm.
And that took a lot of years to get to that point. So it does come with a maturity of roles, and also I value myself. So I take on things that I think are good for me. I also take on things that pay me. So I don't do a lot of things for free. And when I do things for free, it's because it has other
Yeah.
non-monetary value, right?
Yeah.
And
Thank
so
you
I,
for saying that, because I think that we don't say that enough in academic medicine, and it's really good advice.
yeah, and you have to have a balance. You kind of have to take on those paid roles and make them your priority and grow something good out of that, because that's actually how you protect yourself from some of the, because I think you're right, the antidote to burnout is having a lot of different things that fulfill you. So when one is not going as well as the other, but to get to that complement of things means you have to buy down, our clinical demands, which tend to be the main payer of our work and time. And we know that we just talked about how the ICU isn't very forgiving and the staffing
Yeah.
isn't quite the way we'd like it to be. So, yeah, looking for those opportunities that align with your passion areas. And if you can get paid to do it, that is exactly the right thing to do.
Well, I'm not getting paid to do this podcast, but it is very fulfilling, and I've loved talking to you. We finish the podcast always with some quick hit questions,
Okay.
so people can learn a little bit more about you. What passions or hobbies do you have outside of out of work?
Gosh, I think one of the things that's been so nice this year is I love to travel. Hold on, let me put my phone on pause. We knew that was going to happen.
We knew it was going to happen. We're going to leave that in.
All right. The so I love to travel, and traveling internationally and seeing a new culture, trying new foods, things like that. That's something I've been happy to get back to doing this past year. I really like music, and I really miss hearing and seeing live music. That was
Mm.
something that I always enjoyed. So kind of getting back to doing that again. It's just a way to sort of maybe escape and travel somewhere else when you can't physically get there. You can kind of experience a different language, culture, things like that through music and art also. And so those are things I like to do. And now that they're more available and open to me, I'm kind of back into discovering new things again. I don't have I'm trying to think of what another hobby would be that would be more creative that I can sort of do
That's
that
okay.
doesn't require like, traveling or going anywhere. So I'm still looking for that next hobby that I can learn something. It's good for my brain to stave off dementia.
Yeah. What if you weren't a neurointensivist, what other specialty would you like to attempt?
Oh, that's a tough question because I don't think I have anything else I'd rather do than this job. I really love being a neurointensivist. I guess by default, I'm also one of those hybrid doctors. I'm also a stroke neurologist, and so that's probably too related a field. I don't think I could do anything better than this. This is sort of what
This
I'm
is
meant
it.
to do. But if it was at someday if I have to retire from this job clinically, I don't know. Let's see if there was another specialty. I've always wanted to be a neurosurgeon, but that's probably not a second career kind of realistically kind of thing. I think that's why I love my neurosurgeon so much. I actually really like the surgical arena a lot, but that's more of a if I had a wish list that I would probably want to be a neurosurgeon for the
Yeah.
day.
And what specialty would you not like to do?
The reason you go into neurology is it's kind of a clean field. CSF can only get so messy.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
but I would say so it's a between GI and that's probably the one that a little too messy for me.
Well, maybe this is a nice corollary to that. Is there a sound or smell in the ICU that you really actually like, or that is something that brings you joy?
It's so funny, that for my husband, who's not a doctor, he says the hospital has a smell. And I don't smell that. I like this is the ICU. It's great. And
Yeah.
I it is my comfort zone. I maybe it's like white noise to hear all the pings
Hmm.
and buzzes and alarms and things that go off all the time, that it's quite comforting to me, and I don't even hear the noise sometimes. It's just sort of white noise there. That actually is a pleasant sound to me. I don't have to sleep in the ICU, so that's probably different for patients who have to hear that
Yeah.
24/7. But I find a lot of that kind of like the sound of the ICU is actually a good thing. For the GI smells, that I could do without.
Okay. And then to finish up, what advice would you give to a fellow who's about to graduate?
The arc of a career is long. So you want to just start in a place where you're mostly happy and that you feel like you can get a good start. And you may not know exactly what you want to do right away, but you want to be in a place that I think feels supportive, that you actually can contribute something and feel good about the work you're doing, and allows you to kind of explore your passions a little bit more, because your career will move and ebb and flow as you mature in the field. And that's the beauty of medicine. Like, you don't have to do the same thing you do now, and you may find that you will do something else in a few years from now, and opportunities will come up. So I think that's the best thing, is just to know yourself and to know what makes you happy, and to try to align those things in your first sort of career step. And everything else just kind of falls into place.
All right. Well, thank you, Dr. Ko. This was an incredible podcast. I really enjoyed it. As I said, it's filling my buckets, and this has been a complete pleasure. Thank you too to our listeners. These podcasts are available anywhere you get your podcasts, and CME are available, so check them out. Thanks for having us, and have a great new year.